Hello and welcome to this month's Insight. For generations, we've been told that there are two distinct ways of knowing: the cool, methodical path of reason and the abrupt, unpredictable flash of intuition. The renowned scientist Dr. Jonas Salk has said, "It is always with excitement that I wake up in the morning wondering what my intuition will toss up to me like gifts from the sea. I work with it. I rely on it. It's my partner." Dr. Salk, along with other great achievers, recognizes the immense power and practical value that are available to each of us in the form of a sudden intuitive flash of insight. Unfortunately, many of us don't trust our hunches or gut feelings. Because we can't measure intuition or plan for it to occur, we tend to neglect the calling of this most vital human resource, and that's a great loss. Philip Goldberg is a great believer in accessing the knowledge available through intuition. He's helped thousands to integrate their natural intuitive abilities into decision-making and problem-solving skills to use in their daily lives. With his suggestions, you, like Dr. Jonas Salk, will work with intuition, learn to rely on it, and make it a good partner. And now here's Philip Goldberg with several ideas for unlocking your intuition.
Every decision you make, every action you take is based on a desire to bring about a certain outcome: greater happiness, material success, better relationships, or whatever. The quality of those decisions and actions hinges on what you know and how you think. And that depends a great deal on how intuitive you are. If you look at history, you'll find that most successful and inventive people in all fields of endeavor, the people who make breakthroughs, who create new products and ideas, who solve difficult problems, they've either been very intuitive or they've had enough good sense and courage to pay attention to their intuition, usually both. As Albert Einstein said when asked how he made his discoveries, the really valuable thing is intuition. But intuition isn't only a key component of what we call genius. It's also a necessary ingredient in everyday life. Business leaders, for example, rely on it far more than we once believed. Executives are supposed to be objective, rational thinkers who make decisions based on rigorous analysis and hard statistical data. And to a large extent, that's true. But it's not the whole truth. According to researchers, high-ranking executives who have to cope with tremendous chaos and complexity every day have to rely a great deal on hunches and feelings. One of those researchers, Henry Mintzberg of McGill University, put it this way, quote, "Organizational effectiveness does not lie in that narrow-minded concept called rationality. It lies in a blend of clear-headed logic and powerful intuition," unquote. Now, whether or not you're an executive by profession, you are an executive in your own life. You're president and chief operating officer in charge of your own happiness and success, so you too need that blend of logic and powerful intuition. You know those people who always seem to be in the right place at the right time, the ones we think of as lucky and whom we might secretly envy? Well, they're not just lucky. They are intuitive. Whether they realize it or not, their intuition is guiding them like an inner gyroscope, away from mistakes and toward the right choices. And you can expect more of that yourself when you learn to work more effectively with your own intuition. This doesn't require learning something foreign, as in speaking a new language. Intuition is as natural to human beings as reasoning or remembering. We're all intuitive. You are intuitive. Very few of us use this natural gift we call intuition as effectively as we could. We ignore intuition, we suppress it, we do any number of things that restrict or constrain it. It's as if we had a powerful computer at our disposal, but didn't quite know how to use it to its full capacity. The first step in that process is to understand exactly what intuition is and what it does. So, what is intuition? The dictionary defines it as the act or faculty of knowing directly without the use of rational processes. Personally, I like the definition I got from a 15-year-old acquaintance of mine better. She said, "Intuition's like when you know something, but like, where did it come from?" I'm sure you know what she meant. Think of the times you've used terms like hunch or gut feeling, as in, I have a strong hunch that guy's lying, or I don't know why, but my gut tells me the deal's going to go through. We use those terms in situations where we kind of know something but can't quite explain how we know it. You might feel something with great conviction, but be unable to prove it step by step, like a theorem in geometry. You can't marshal up evidence to defend the feeling. You can't construct a logical argument that would convince a judge and jury. You just know. Now, by now you're probably thinking, okay, I know what intuition is, but how does it work? Well, I'm afraid the only easy answer is we don't know. Intuition is not easy to study since it's not something you can pin down in a laboratory and look at under a microscope. As for what happens in the brain when we're intuitive, well, science hasn't even figured out how we remember our own phone numbers, let alone how we can know who's dialed it when we hear the phone ring, or how we have any good hunch or idea for that matter. What we can say is this: the mind takes in information both consciously and unconsciously, through the senses, and probably also in subliminal ways, perhaps even ways that are usually called psychic. Some of the processing is done through conscious reasoning, but only some. The unconscious does most of the processing when we're not even aware that anything is going on, when we're thinking about something else, or even while we're asleep. Intuition is the result of these unconscious processes, and it can come in a flash when least expected. It might be verbal, like a voice, or visual, like a picture, or it might be a physical sensation or an emotion. Often it's a combination of these. Sometimes it's clear, concrete, unequivocal. Other times it's kind of vague and unspecific, perhaps even symbolic, as in a dream. It usually occurs spontaneously, without deliberate effort on our part. Actually, what's more important than how intuition works is what it does. So to get a better idea of what you can expect from improving your own intuitive skills, let's talk about the many roles intuition plays in our lives. Its contribution is much more diverse than we usually realize. I've identified 6 different functions or types of intuition. The first is discovery. Have you ever been working on a problem or struggling to find a solution that's eluded you when suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, the answer pops into your mind? An answer you're unable to prove at the time, but that later turns out to be correct? It holds not only for great breakthroughs in science, but for everyday garden variety problems that we all face. When, for example, a parent intuits exactly what's bothering a child, even when the child won't tell. Or when an executive has a feeling about what his competitor's about to do. Those are incidents of intuitive discovery. The next category is creative intuition. This resembles imagination. It's when the mind brings forth good and useful ideas in situations where there are many alternatives. Artists, for example, use this function to come up with just the right dab of color, or just the right musical note, or just the right word. Sometimes creative ideas flood the mind, gushing in as if the artist was merely a conduit for some outside source. But it's not only artists who have this experience. It works for all of us in situations where imaginative solutions are needed. Entrepreneurs, for example, are usually people who rely on creative intuition. So do smart corporate leaders, who encourage it among their employees. Now, for the third category, what I call evaluation. Suppose you have to make a choice between 2 options. Say, to go to a particular party or not go, or to take a certain person at their word or not take them at their word, or to take a job offer or turn it down. We're faced with such choices on minor matters and important ones all the time. It's an experience you're probably all familiar with. You might sense an inner voice that whispers to you, "Do it," or "Don't go there." Or you might feel a strong negative sensation when you start to do something, and a positive sensation when you think about the opposite. No doubt, like the rest of us, you've gone against those signals at times, only to moan later on, "I knew I shouldn't have done that. Something told me I'd be sorry." Well, something was telling you, the evaluative function of intuition. Sometimes it'll lead you away from conventional wisdom and toward an unorthodox choice, maybe one that seems absurd or risky, but it just might be the right choice. For example, there was once a businessman who was tempted to purchase what was then a novelty, a fast food hamburger stand. He called in his expert consultants, and they told him, forget it, it's not worth the price. But, as Ray Kroc put it, he felt something in his funny bone, so he bought it anyway. That business is known as McDonald's. Sometimes it pays to listen to your funny bone. Now, the fourth kind of intuition I call operational. It's a subtle kind of intuition. It guides you when you're not even aware that you need guidance. It helps you navigate through life. Sometimes it's bold and assertive. Sometimes it's just a quiet whisper that prompts or pulls or pushes, nudging you in a certain direction. Say to call a particular person or to visit a certain place or maybe to avoid a certain situation. Often there seems to be no apparent reason for it, but if you pay attention, you'll probably end up in the right place at the right time more often than not. Others will call it coincidence or luck. You'll know it's intuition. Let me give you an example. In 1941, when the Nazis were bombing London, Winston Churchill used to go out to visit anti-aircraft batteries to boost morale. His driver always opened the same door, and Churchill always sat in the same seat, until one night, the driver opened the door, but Churchill walked around the car, let himself in another door, and sat on the opposite side. As they were driving, a bomb exploded. Had Churchill been sitting in his usual seat, he might have been seriously injured. Later on, he explained what happened this way. Something said to me, stop, before I reached the car door held open for me. It then appeared to me that I was told I was meant to open the door on the other side and get in and sit there. Your intuition tells you things like that all the time, and probably, like most of us, you ignore it too often. Pay attention. Those urges might make much more sense than you can possibly appreciate at the time. Our fifth category is predictive intuition. Every time you make a decision, you're predicting the future. You do one thing and not another because you anticipate that the results down the road will be to your advantage. Now, obviously, it pays to know the future, but it's very difficult to make predictions exclusively on the basis of logical analysis. Why? Because you'll always be predicting the future on the basis of what happened in the past, and you can never be sure that anything will ever stay the same. That's why intuition is so essential in decision-making. When you have a feeling that hiring Mary will work out better than hiring John, or that one school will be better for your child than another, you too are being guided by the predictive function of intuition. It may feel like you're guessing, but if your intuition is on the beam, those predictions will be more accurate than mere guesswork could ever be. Now, no discussion of intuition would be complete without the sixth category, what I call illumination. It's been called by many other names throughout history: Satori, Samadhi, Nirvana, enlightenment. It's that sublime state of knowing and being in which one apprehends in a direct, intuitive way the transcendent essence of existence. It's a state typically described as perfect unity of the self and the cosmos, a sense of oneness accompanied by a feeling of bliss and a certainty that reality itself is divine. Those who have experienced this state have been transformed, and they're often so moved that they describe their vision in words that become religious hymns or secular poems that inspire the rest of us to seek the same wisdom. Understanding intuition makes you more sensitive to it and more aware of it in your own life. It's a very important step. You're now much less likely to work against your intuition by poo-pooing it or rejecting it or not recognizing it in the first place. And your own resistance is the major obstacle you have to overcome, since none of us has ever been taught how to use our intuition. Now let's move on to some practical tips that deal mainly with the attitudes and habits that affect the use of intuition. Tip number 1, the readiness is all. Shakespeare said that, and it applies as much to your intuition as it did to Hamlet. Intuition can't be ordered or coerced or implored or contrived. Intuition comes when it's good and ready. What you can do is to make your mind more receptive to it, and for that, the key ingredient is the condition of your nervous system. When your mind is both quiet and alert, your intuitive capacity is greatly enhanced. If your mind is turbulent, busy with gibberish and background noise, it's like a radio with so much static you can't hear the music. But quietness is not enough either. You can be quiet and dull, like when you're tired or drunk or tranquilized. My advice is this: avoid substances and environmental conditions that dull the mind or make it too agitated. Instead, adopt habits and practices that reduce stress and increase calmness. To my mind, the best techniques for achieving this are yoga and meditation, ancient disciplines that were designed precisely to enhance mental clarity and inner serenity. Tip number 2, believe in your intuition. This may sound obvious, but our culture has been biased against intuition and feeling. So when we get a hunch, we have a tendency to censor it or reject it, especially if there's no immediate proof. The point is, all of us, especially men, tend to suppress our intuition because we've been conditioned to not really believe in it. Believe in intuition enough so that you encourage it, become receptive to it, and take it seriously. Tip number 3, be open to unorthodox ideas. Intuition often feeds us innovative answers that seem to go against logic or conventional wisdom. That's one of its beauties. So don't automatically reject an intuition because it's unusual or unexpected. Allow it the test of time. Tip number 4, be willing to take risks. If you're afraid to look foolish, you might reject intuitive ideas, especially in situations where you might be criticized or challenged. Tip number 5, don't resist change, ambiguity, or uncertainty. Most situations in life involve one or all of those conditions. If you're unable to tolerate them, you'll probably stifle your intuition by always doing what's safe and secure. It's better in the long run to endure some discomfort and give your intuitive mind room to operate. Tip 6, cultivate flexibility. We all acquire ways of doing things that become habitual, either procedures of our own or procedures that we've been taught in school or training programs. These are important, and they can free the mind by making certain actions automatic instead of something you have to think about. But if taken to an extreme, formal procedures can restrict your intuition. Sometimes trying a totally different approach or improvising can stimulate your intuition. Tip number 7, broaden your horizons. By bringing into your mind a broad base of information and a wide variety of impressions, you give your unconscious much more raw material to work with. The input you get from reading, traveling, talking to people whose interests are different from your own, they may not seem relevant, but your unconscious might find analogies and metaphors that come together later as intuitions. Which brings me to tip number 8, get away from it all. Research has shown that inspiration often arrives when the person is away from the problem at hand, on a hiking trail, in the kitchen or the bath, on a bus or a ship or wherever. Apparently, when the mind is disengaged from the problem, the unconscious is free to do work that it might not otherwise be able to accomplish. Psychologists call this process incubation. In our frenzy to solve a problem, we often burn and churn long past the point where the effort is useful, and we end up simply spinning our wheels. Sometimes it's more productive to get away, whether for 10 minutes or a day or a month. Find ways of incubating that work for you and build them into your routine. Tip number 9, be the prey, not the predator. As I've mentioned, intuition is a spontaneous, sometimes fleeting event. It can zip past you like a roadrunner and be gone before you know it. So it pays to be alert for its arrival and do what it takes to keep it around long enough to see what it is. Intuition is often preceded by a subtle, barely perceptible feeling, a sort of intimation that something is coming. Be alert for this feeling, this advanced signal, and when it comes, remember this: the key is to shift your mind into neutral. Don't search for anything, don't force anything, don't pounce on it. Just wait, alert and calm like a spectator. Let it assume its own form without imposing anything on it. You might even stop what you're doing and close your eyes if the circumstances permit. Just be neutral and attentive. And if a sense of meaning begins to unfold, let it unfold by itself. Don't analyze or evaluate or criticize. Just remain innocent and non-judgmental. Now, this advice may sound vague, but you'll know what I mean when it happens to you next. Tip 10. Get familiar with your own intuition. The question I'm most often asked is, how can we know when our intuition is correct? That's an important question, since we tend to make either of two mistakes. We can reject an intuition that we ought to accept, or we can embrace a thought that seems like a good intuition, but is actually an imposter. As a precaution, there are certain questions you can ask yourself when you have an intuition. For example, suppose you're tempted to reject a particular intuition. You might ask yourself, am I rejecting it because it's telling me something I don't want to know? Am I afraid that acting on it will make me look foolish? Do I lack faith in my own intuition? As a rule, if an intuition evokes a very strong sensation and is persistent enough to keep popping up, it deserves to be taken seriously. But the best approach is to become familiar with the nuances of your intuition. Most people find that there's a constellation of factors that surround a good intuition as opposed to a false one. Learn what they are in your case. Well, that brings us to the end of our journey together. You should now have a clear understanding of what intuition is and why it's so important in our lives, and you're equipped to make the most of its potential. Your intuition will guide you toward smart decisions, creative solutions, deep insight, and in general, a more fulfilling life, if you use the tools you've acquired in this tape. I have a strong hunch you will.
That was Philip Goldberg explaining how you can sharpen the intuitive edge. And now here are more inspiring ideas from the Dean of Personal Development, Earl Nightingale.
Industrial psychologists Bob Hobart and Jim Martin point out that managing your people is like managing your marriage. The more you praise, compliment, encourage, and support your spouse and your employees, the healthier and the more lasting both relationships will be. The more you criticize, find fault with, or worse yet, take for granted what your family and employees are doing, the more likely they will be to do it without you. Hobart and Martin ask the question, how many marriages do you know that have ended in divorce because the partners were too caring, too praising, too encouraging, and too supportive of each other? On the other hand, how many divorced people do you know who have said their partners didn't care about them, found too much fault with them, or took them for granted? The same premise applies to people who stay with their jobs or leave them. Employees subjected to a great deal of criticism are likely to leave, as are those who feel that good performance is taken for granted. People who are encouraged, praised, complimented, and supported are much more likely to be long tenured in any organization. To find out how good a manager or marriage partner you are, here are some questions. Hobart and Martin say these questions will help you identify what you're doing and how you might be more effective. Yesterday, how many compliments did you give to your people, or to your spouse or children? Yesterday, how many times did you criticize your subordinates or your spouse or children? Did you spend most of your time last week attending to your best and most important performers, or to your least effective producers, and why? How much of your waking time was spent last week on work or work-related tasks, and how much was spent with your family? And finally, are the answers to those questions what you would like them to be? I've known some good managers who didn't seem to me to be especially complimentary. They were, however, great example setters, fair, hard-working, dedicated people who provided such outstanding leadership that those in their charge were highly motivated to make good showings also. But Hobart and Martin are certainly right about giving compliments or a nod of approval or a clap on the shoulder or other indication that you're aware of a person's excellent efforts and that you appreciate him. It's so important to compliment children and everyone we love, to take notice of what they do, to admire their efforts and show interest in and enthusiasm for their projects. People bloom under such thoughtfulness, as employees do under praise. Some years ago, a man came into my office whom I've never forgotten, and for whom I've never stopped feeling sorry. And I've often thought there must be thousands of people in the same boat. My secretary had given him an appointment, and he started right off on the wrong foot by arriving 15 minutes late. He then told me a long, sad story. As I remember it, it went something like this. Mr. Nightingale, everyone tells me I have a beautiful singing voice. In fact, they tell me my voice is better than most of the male singers in this country, including, and right here he tossed out the names of our highest paid male singing stars. I asked him why he'd come to me, and he replied it was because I was in the radio and television business. I then asked him what he had done to get his voice heard by people other than his family and friends, who all raved about what a great voice he had. He got a sort of pained look on his face and said something to the effect that someone ought to do something about the fact that he had such a great voice. At first I thought he was kidding, but after studying for a moment, I realized he was quite serious. I then tried to explain as patiently as I could that when we have something we think is worthwhile, it's up to us to do something about it. I told him that in his case, his course was clear. Since he had the finest larynx since Caruso, he should do two things. One, he should study voice under a competent coach. Two, he should sing every chance he got, sing in church, sing for service clubs, sing for nothing, but sing until he qualified for the big chance he felt someone ought to give him. I then went on to explain that the world didn't give two hoops and you know where whether or not he had a good voice. He could make Perry Como sound like the baritone in the Salvation Army Quartet. But unless he brought his songs to the people, the world would keep turning, the sun would still come up, and he could just forget about the whole thing. Then, thinking that maybe I was being a little rough on him, I told him how all the big stars got started, how they worked and kept going and kept picking themselves up every time something or someone knocked them down, until they'd earned the greatness and the corresponding rewards they sought. Well, I guess I made quite a little speech, but I couldn't reach him. He finally left the same way he came in, petulant and hurt because the world didn't stand at attention just because the good Lord had given him a great voice. He probably went back to his hometown, where his mother would sit in pure rapture while he shook the kitchen walls with his booming basso or whatever he had. This was quite a number of years ago, and I wonder whatever became of him. Probably the same thing that happens to thousands of other young people, even though they've been awarded the precious gift of real talent. Nothing at all. While the great stars keep coming along, working their way up the hard way and someday knowing the acclaim of the world that will pay any price for greatness except make it easy to get there. Having an outstanding talent is like raising a great crop. Unless you take it to market and sell it, the world will never miss it because no one will ever know that it exists. If you think you have something the world should know about, make it your career to see that the world knows about it. A man by the name of Daniel Burnham once stated, "Make no little plans. There's nothing in little plans to stir men's blood. Make big plans. Once a big idea is recorded, it can never die." Well, that's really great, isn't it? Now, how does it apply to you? How big are your plans? If someone has begun to find his daily life something of a bore, rather humdrum or uninteresting, it could be because his plans are too small. A human being needs, as Mr. Burnham said, a big plan if he's to stir his blood, if he's to bring excitement and interest into his life. You know, more people would make bigger plans if they knew they could be accomplished. The people who've stood out in history have been those with big plans that caught the fancy and imagination of others. You might just for fun stop a minute and reevaluate your plans. What are they? What are you working toward? Is it big enough for you? Does it fill you with excitement when you think about it? And does it fill your days with energy and accomplishment? Maybe your plans are too small. All too often there's a wide gap between what a person could accomplish and what he's actually accomplished. What is it you want to do or have more than anything else? If you can answer that question, you can discover the direction you should very probably take, the course that's right for you. Usually there's a very good reason for your wanting to accomplish a particular goal. Usually your particular talents and abilities coincide with that goal. People accomplish what they set out to accomplish, but they often don't realize the extent of their own greatness and make their plans accordingly. They take their cue from those around them, assuming that what others do is right for them also. Maybe it is, but maybe it isn't. Of one thing you can be sure: if the plan toward which you're working does not keep you interested and fill you with excitement at the prospect of its accomplishment, your plan is probably too small. What is it that you really want to do? Why don't you do it? If it's good and hurts no one, go after it. You might be amazed at what you can do. People usually are. But the goals that come naturally to them usually do so for very good reasons. No one will really desire with all his heart something that's beyond his accomplishment. Make no little plans. There's nothing in little plans to stir men's blood. Make big plans. Once a big idea is recorded, it can never die. That's good.
That was Earl Nightingale. And now please turn this cassette over to hear Norman Cousins on side 2.